Two and a Half Admins, episode 173. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. Google Drive users say Google lost their files. Google is investigating. And then we've got an article from Google, how to restore files for Drive for desktop. So what happened here is the desktop client for Google Drive somehow messed up and deleted a bunch of people's files.
I would just like to point out that, as usual in my experience for Google services, their announcement reads, if you're among the small subset of Drive for desktop users who experienced issues, every freaking time Google has a service issue, they talk about what a tiny, tiny subset of users are impacted by it, and yet somehow, every single time, my clients are in that subset. Kind of makes you wonder how that works, huh?
It makes me think that even a small percentage of Google users is actually quite a large number.
Yes, but I think Jim's point was that they were minimizing the number.
That's absolutely true that a very small percentage of Google users is a very large number of people. However, that still shouldn't mean that to somebody like myself with a fairly wide stable of clients, you see every one of these vanishingly rare issues impact multiple of your particular stable of clients. That strongly implies that maybe we need a little bit more granular metrics on what a small subset actually means mathematically to the folks at Google who are writing these announcements.
It was interesting how it manifested with basically files going back to whatever state they were in May 2023, which seems to be when they made the change to how the desktop client accessed the files. And I guess at that point, it stopped keeping copies locally and always streaming off the cloud. And so when that stopped working, all you saw on your desktop was the version of the files from the last time it actually wrote to your hard drive. And that was in May. And I can imagine how disconcerting it would be to just have all your files suddenly roll back to more than 6 months ago and be like, what the hell's going on here? Where's all my files?
I might go so far as to point out that Google has, let's just say, a little bit of a track history with releasing really subpar desktop applications. Google generally does a very good job with back-end programming and web design. They don't tend to put the same kind of care, effort, or expertise into desktop application development as absolutely anybody who has ever tried to use the blecherous Microsoft Outlook plugin for G Suite or Google Workspace or whatever they're calling it this week can tell you. That client has been a giant flaming ball of crap, barely sufficient to say, we have a client for more than a decade now.
Well, they don't support Linux, so I've never personally used any of their desktop software, especially not Drive.
Right, and that's the thing. So since they don't support Linux, and since you're accessing all your Google properties over the web, you might have a rather different interpretation as to how reliable those things can be than if you actually had to write desktop code that came from Google. Because again, in my personal experience and my personal opinion, they don't do a good job with it. They do barely enough to get it out the door, and as far as they're concerned, good enough. It's not really where that company lives and breathes or how it thinks. We see that in issues like these that you don't generally see on the back end. You know, like when I talked about Google workplaces or workspaces or, Gmail or whatever you want to call it being terrible in Outlook. Well, Gmail works great in the browser. It's a pretty fantastic webmail interface. I like Roundcube a little bit better personally, but that is very much a personal preference, and also Roundcube does fewer things than the Gmail interface does, and it is quite good, and it has worked reliably the whole time. But I've been having to tell clients who got on Google Workspaces who have, VPs who refuse to access email in any other way than Microsoft Outlook, I have been having to tell them for 10 freaking years now, over and over and over again, okay, that email that you can't find in Outlook, you need to go to mail.google.com and log in and search for it there. And they go, and oh, yeah, there's that mail. I'm like, yeah, I know.
There's some complications to this as well. It turns out that Google Drive for Desktop actually has 2 different operating modes. One, called mirroring, is similar to Dropbox, where files on your hard drive in the Google Drive location get uploaded to the cloud and also downloaded on all your other devices, and they stay on your computer. So you put the file in Google Drive, and it goes to the cloud and to your other computers and stays on your computer. It's harder to imagine losing files in this mode since at the end of the day, they're still files on your hard drive. They're not just going to magically disappear, and they should be on your other computers still if you have multiple computers. Although, at the same time, we think back to Apple's iMusic or whatever, where it was deleting certain of your MP3s if you had a copy in their thing, and they're like, oh, you don't need that on your hard drive anymore. You can always just stream it from us. And then deleting your copies of the songs. And, it's always possible the desktop client can screw up like that. But the other mode, the file stream mode, where most files are never actually stored on your computer. Instead, they get fancy shortcuts to files that are exclusively in the cloud and just get pulled down as you try to use them. So you're expected to have an always-on internet connection, and when you try to open a cloud file link, the actual data is quickly streamed to your device so applications can access it. FileStream does keep a cache of recently and frequently used files on your computer to make it faster, but Drive will actively remove files from your computer once it's uploaded them and you're not using them.
I would also have appreciated concrete metrics with units and numbers on files will be quickly delivered when you open them live in streaming mode. That's not entirely under Google's control.
If it's in the cache, it'll be fast. And if it's not, well, you're subject to the laws of the internet.
This is probably a good point to kick off into a not Google specific bit of a philosophical rant. When I was much younger, the older generation, oh God, there it is. I am officially an old man. Well, anyway, when I was much younger, the older generation constantly was talking about the KISS principle. Keep it simple, stupid. I mean, it was hard to go a couple of weeks without somebody talking about KISS this, KISS that, keep it simple, keep it simple, keep it simple. And lately, it seems like everybody's kind of either forgotten about or decided they don't like that idea. If you're using the Google Drive application in streaming mode, you're really not doing things very differently from just going to drive.google.com and downloading files and opening them and then uploading them again once you've finished working in them. Is that a tiny bit more, in the way of clicks for you? Yes. Does it avoid, a few thousand lines of code? Also, yes. If you keep things simple in your workflow, you eliminate the attack surface for an awful lot of bugs or vulnerabilities to creep in. And it feels like these days, everybody just wants everything installed all the time, all the bells, all the whistles, and then they're mad when the bells don't ring and the whistles don't whistle.
I think this speaks to a broader point, this idea that people younger than about 30 don't really understand what a file system is on the whole, don't have the concept of it. And so the idea that the files are on the computer or in the cloud, it doesn't really make any difference to them as long as they're in the application.
Yeah, we've talked about that before, partly because of the way iOS security mechanisms work, that you save files in an application and you can share from one application to another, but you can't just start up application 2 and go open the file out of My Documents or whatever, because it's not saved there and that program is not allowed to access the other directory. And there are definitely advantages to that in terms of security, but it really does break the fundamental model of the hierarchy of file systems that most of us grew up with. Although Jim's old enough, maybe that was back when file systems didn't have directories.
Well, you wouldn't really have called it a file system then. I mean, yeah, there was technically a file system when you streamed data down onto a Philips cassette tape from a Trash 80, but nobody really called that a file system.
You had filing systems with cabinets and physical folders and files, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, now those still exist. I mean, if you work in the business world, file cabinets with hanging folders and tabs are very much still a real physical thing. They haven't gone away yet.
But it's getting to be an analogy some young people don't understand.
It is. And we've covered this in considerably more length
Yes.
in an earlier episode, but the tagline here is we had this magical single cohort that was like half of Gen X and half of the millennials, roughly, where pretty much everybody had to get a general grasp of, how a computer file system is organized. I'm not saying that everybody out of those two halves of a generation were experts, don't get me wrong. But, you had about 20 years there split between those generations when the adults from, those two halves of those two generations, pretty much everybody had to have the idea of like, okay, so I make a folder and I put my stuff in it. And I can make a folder in that folder if I want to, and folders are where things go.
And I can copy that folder to this external media and take it with me and then use it over there and bring it back.
Right. So prior to the second half of Gen X, nobody knew what any of that was because computers were just magic and everybody was terrified of them and had no idea how they worked to begin with. And, you could try to make analogies with physical filing cabinets, but they didn't go over well because everybody just wanted to sacrifice a chicken and dance in the entrails. And then you get to the newer generation where everything's mobile and everything has gone back to abstracting the file system away. And, it's applications that have either been pre-configured to talk to each other or haven't. And you largely just live with it either way. I think part of the problem is just that learning the intricacies of a hierarchical data storage system, it's a lot more abstract intellectually than a typical human really wants to dive into. If you don't make them, they won't. Most people intuitively function in a much less logical and hierarchical way, and that's because we like to think of ourselves as logical creatures, but we are all just a heap of crappy vector math and unsupervised training when it comes right down to it.
It is worth pointing out that we're not talking about people who work in IT, because there are plenty of people who are like 18, 20 who do know about this stuff because they work in IT and listen to shows like this. So we don't want to offend those people. We're talking about the normies here.
That is absolutely correct. We are not talking about IT professionals. We're not talking about IT enthusiasts. We're talking about the folks in the family that has a nephew who is good at computer. And in a lot of cases, we actually, unfortunately, are talking about the nephew who is good at computer, because increasingly these days, the nephew who is good at computer is probably more good at Android or good at iPhone.
The other part not to gloss over here is that trying to do something like Google Drive is creating a giant distributed system where, you're trying to keep the file in sync across multiple devices, and especially if you've got people trying to change it at both sides. That's always been complicated and hard to do. And it didn't suddenly get easier. Google just put layer after layer of stuff on it. And when it goes wrong, it goes really wrong like this. And sometimes it's better to avoid the complexity. Like Jim said, keep it simple.
And part of the problem here is that while it's almost certainly not anything that we would truly recognize as a file system on the back end in the cloud on Google's hardware, it doesn't help that on the local side, it truly is file systems. Because if you've ever done much in the way of back-end development or supervised back-end development, as a system administrator or architect, one of the things that you're probably aware of is that this stuff that we're talking about with replication from, to multiple sites and multiple users who may be working in a different site, doing different things at the same time, it's not a problem that you solve with a file system. It's a problem that you solve with a database application. And within a database application, you can build it from scratch to work well with this and work, well with having massive collaboration at multiple sites, multiple users, yada, 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 because you're doing all that from the beginning. File systems weren't designed for that. Modern file systems at least, were absolutely designed for multiple users, but they were not designed for, multiple instances of the storage at multiple locations that have to replicate back and forth to one another.
Yeah, this Google Doc that we're all looking at for this show is not really a doc, is it? It's just an entry in a database somewhere. You can export it to a doc. You can basically create a document out of it, but it's not really a document sitting on a file system somewhere.
Well, it is a doc. What it isn't is a file.
It's at least a versioned object.
Yeah, it's a blob that's sitting in a field, in a row, in a database, is really what it is when it comes down to it. And I say that. Somebody might quibble with me about the exact definition of database. To whoever that pedant happens to be who's getting ready to fire up their email client, I did not say that it was a relational database. I just said database. So get off my lawn.
Yeah, and if you're really going to get at Jim, then get at him for mispronouncing pedant. Okay, this episode is sponsored by Kolide. If you work in security or IT and your company has Okta, this message is for you. Have you noticed that for the past few years, the majority of data breaches and hacks you read about have something in common? It's employees. Hackers absolutely love exploiting vulnerable employee devices and credentials, but it doesn't have to be this way. Imagine a world where only secure devices can access your cloud apps. In this world, phished credentials are useless to hackers, and you can manage every OS, even Linux, from a single dashboard. Best of all, you can get employees to fix their own device security issues without creating more work for IT. The good news is, you don't have to imagine this world. You can just start using Kolide. Kolide is a device trust solution for companies with Okta, and it ensures that if a device isn't trusted and secure, it can't log into your cloud apps. So support the show and visit kolide.com/25A to watch a demo and see how it works. That's KOLIDE.com/25A. Just about every Windows and Linux device is vulnerable to a new logo fail firmware attack.
So first, you build a nice secure system, and then you decide, what'll make this system even more secure if we secure the boot process. And then you decide, we need to make sure to lock it away from the user, the person who bought it, just absolutely everything. Let's get it locked down as far as humanly possible. Perfect. Wait, not perfect. What's the one thing we're missing? We have to put our logo in the middle of the screen when you turn it on.
Yep. So it turns out this new series of attacks dubbed Logo Fail is notably very easy to do and completely persistent. So the BIOS manufacturers make a tool that they sign so that your virus scanner will agree that this is a legitimate tool that lets you change the manufacturer logo that shows up when the machine first powers on. However, if you were to put in a malicious image file that when the UEFI firmware boots up and decodes the image caused a buffer overflow, you could end up executing this malicious code in the UEFI BIOS, especially during the most critical stage, DXE, or driver execution environment, because that is the most privileged time when you're running the EFI driver stuff that can talk to all the devices, read all of memory, do whatever it wants. And so you replace the Dell logo with a Dell logo that contains extra data that doesn't show up on the screen and causes the BIOS to run extra code. And all this happens before any of Secure Boot even has a chance to happen and has access to memory to fiddle with things, and means that you now can compromise the computer and the operating system, even though it's supposed to be safe with Secure Boot and Intel's boot guard. All of that can be bypassed by this image file that just runs in there.
Now, you might be champing at the bit and saying, hang on a second there, Alan. You're thinking in your car or home as you listen to this podcast. Now, how are you going to go and replace that image? Because then you won't match the signature in these UEFI images as opposed to the logo images. They're signed, right? The only problem is, no, the logo itself is not part of that signed image. It is completely unsigned, and you can, on most BIOSes, put anything you want to there. Now, this is kind of cool from like a hacker perspective, and most of us have probably known that one person who got like really excited about figuring out the tools and being able to reflash that, now they've got some stupid picture that shows in the middle of their laptop before the operating system boots. Cool. But this also opens the door to exactly everything that we've been talking about. This is not a really sophisticated kind of an attack or kind of a vulnerability. It's the most trivial. We used a crappy image parsing library that was not well written, is not memory safe. You can buffer overflow it trivially. And then we put absolutely no real safeguards on your ability to change the logo image, which itself is a thing that is a little brain breaking to me. You would think that a corporation that was so excited to get their logo on the screen of your laptop or your computer, you'd think they would also want to protect the integrity of that image by including that in the signed package. But nope.
Well, I think part of it is that the signed package generally comes from the firmware manufacturer. So that'll be, AMI or Phoenix or Award or somebody. And they purposely exclude the image from the signature so that Dell, Lenovo, HP, etc. can change the image without having to re-sign the firmware with their own different key. And to let corporations decide to replace the Dell logo with their own company logo or something, and again, without having to give them the right keys to sign the firmware so it'll be trusted.
I feel like there's enough of a volume of commerce there that one way or the other, that was a very, very solvable problem.
Yep.
In some way other than, well, screw it. Let's just not worry about security. Whether it's, the various OEMs going to the IBVs and being like, oh, hey, can you go ahead and update that image for us? Like, give us a signed image for this particular machine with this particular logo in it. I feel like there's probably enough money changing hands that just doesn't feel like something that couldn't be done. I mean, how many OEMs are there, really? How many different images would we be talking about needing to produce? And how trivial is it just to produce, even if it's a couple of hundred versions? I mean, you do it with a batch script, man.
And so you don't necessarily need physical access to exploit this if you've got other vulnerabilities that you can exploit remotely, like through a browser, for example.
In the video in the article, they just run a Python script and infect the machine. But yeah, if you could exploit a browser or a media player or any other way you can basically get a virus on someone's computer, you can run this logofail virus. The difference is logofail gets installed in the firmware of the motherboard. So even if you reformat the machine or destroy the hard drive and put in a new one, it will still be infected.
There's literally nothing on the drive to detect. If you are looking for infected things on your hard drive, you won't find it because the only thing that changed was that image that's in the boot. And then as you boot, that image with the corrupt data smashes the stack, the extra code gets run, and basically you're living off the land. There's nothing to detect down there on the drive. I feel like the language has maybe been a little less than completely clear about how much access you need to the machine to exploit this bug. It is remotely exploitable in the sense that if you can pop a shell and get admin privileges, that's all you need. So this is not a thing where like before the evil hacker couldn't get into your computer over the internet and now the evil hacker can. What it means is now when the evil hacker gets into your computer over the internet, even if it's completely automated, just, a drive-by download kind of a deal, something deployed in an ad banner or what have you, you're not only infected for right then. It won't just write malware to your hard drive where antivirus might catch it later after definitions get updated. No, it's going to go ahead and change that logo image, and every time you boot your computer, it will automatically be compromised again at boot time for the evil hacker to access. And that can very well include, outbound functionality so that said evil hacker can find your machine, or maybe it just leaves it there with a port open or something. But the point is, it's very difficult to detect. And even if you manage to kill off the code that's running while your machine is running, the next time you reboot it, it's going to be right back.
Yeah, and even if you manage to get the right live CD to try to flash the firmware to overwrite the malware, it might be able to interfere with that as well.
Really gives me flashbacks to the absolute peak days of malware and, like the early to the mid 2000s when essentially every Windows machine you ever saw had at least 3 or 4 grayware, malware packages. And at that point, I would say probably 80% of my business was just running around cleaning malware off of computers, and it literally felt gross. Like you don't usually feel gross working with software, but when you're trying to get rid of a malware infestation and this particular, malware set has like 3 simultaneously running processes, all of which are watchdogs and will reinstantiate the other 2 if you kill them off. And, you're sitting here just trying to like win the race condition to actually get the malware out of memory so that you can then work on getting the malware off the disk. It feels like trying to deal with a cockroach infestation by just like stomping on them and like they're fighting back and scurrying away. It's gross.
Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to 2.5admins.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an ad-free feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And if you want to send any questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. And do send in your questions. And as I always say, ideally not a huge long essay. Ali says, I'm planning a new PC build and I'll be installing Windows 11. I know. A Windows 11 Pro license from Microsoft is a couple of £100, but my friend recommended a website that sells them for £10. A quick Google search told me that they are resold volume licenses. Is it a bad idea to buy one?
That's partly going to depend on your conscience. This is going to anger a lot of people. I know that because I've had this conversation before several times. Those licenses are not legitimate. They were legitimate when the original person who bought them had them. They are not legitimate for resale. Essentially, what you're doing is, you're paying $10 to $20 to pirate Windows. And if that's what you wanted to do, you didn't actually need to spend money for that.
Yeah, this violates the terms of the EULA with Microsoft. And so it's bad for the original volume license holder and for you. And so why spend 10 quid to pirate Windows if you are okay with pirating Windows?
Now, to be fair, it's extremely rare to hear of people having technical issues with these licenses, having them suddenly not work, let alone having Microsoft come after them. It seems pretty clear that, at least for the moment, Microsoft isn't really that interested in pursuing this stuff because they let so many very blatant sites, subreddits, you name it, keep doing it. But again, that doesn't change the fact that it is a terms of service violation. Sometimes you can have problems when the original license holder of the entire volume license removes the entire thing and the whole volume license becomes, illegitimate, not just your individual seat of it. But the biggest thing is just you don't know what's going to change with that in the future. Now, you can say the same thing about any other method of pirating and cracking Windows. Well, it works for now, but it might stop working later, or I might get into trouble, which is true. And again, from my perspective, it's true on both sides. If you want legitimate Windows, buy legitimate Windows. It's generally going to cost you somewhere around $140. If you don't want to pay that $140 and you're still determined to buy Windows and you don't care about piracy, well, you don't need to pay somebody else $10 or $20 to do it. You can just pirate it yourself.
Well, I've never pirated Windows myself, but I've watched YouTube videos about it. And in these videos, it generally involves running some sort of binary to crack Windows and activate it. And that seems to me to be a worse idea to run some random thing, especially it needs admin access usually, than a volume license, which, it might get revoked, but it's not going to be malware, is it? It was once an official Windows license. Surely that's better than pirating it.
It's a fair point in that sense. If you don't trust the tools or the ISOs or, whatever else you're getting by way of your other high seas hijinks, then sure, I guess you can spend 10 quid or 20 quid to get one of these, but still not my jam.
A lot of these sites also sell CD keys for video games, and oftentimes people are like, oh, I can get this game for a lot less money. But especially with the indie games, none of that money is going to the publisher or the actual developers of the game. And worse, oftentimes it actually end up costing the developer of the game money because somebody bought the CD key with a stolen credit card or something, and they're just stealing money from you and the developer at the same time.
And for that matter, speaking of stolen credit cards, if we're going to start scaremongering about the people that you get your pirated nonsense from, Joe raised the valid point that if you're using a CD crack tool or something like that is a binary that you're running, or you're using a pre-cracked ISO that you downloaded, you don't necessarily know what all is in it, and there are potential dangers there. Well, on the same token, if you are buying a pirated key from some site that exists solely to sell pirated software, you're giving them your payment information, so there are risks there too.
Yep, that's a good point.
So I've been racking my brains this whole time. Al and I have been very negative Nancy's about this whole idea of buying the resold volume license keys, which, of course, since I'm a contrarian, has made me think, okay, in what circumstance would I actively recommend doing this? And I actually came up with one. If you have ever been faced with a situation where your completely legitimate copy of Microsoft Windows, through no fault of your own, just decided, nope, I'm not registered anymore and I will not let this key work anymore, and just nothing you do will solve this, and you need a different Windows license, I would absolutely give one of these $10 jobbies a shot, in the same way that I will absolutely sometimes, in theory, pirate a movie and then enjoy it and then buy it from a streaming service.
Right, well, we'd better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send any questions or feedback. You can find me at joerest.com/mastodon.
And you can find me at jrs-s.net/social.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
See you next week.